58 guests sat around the candlelit, orchid-draped tables of the Sterling Manor in Charleston, South Carolina, their crystal glasses clinking in quiet anticipation, when my Uncle Jonathan slammed his fist onto the polished walnut head table so hard the champagne flutes vibrated. "She is an absolute disgrace in that uniform, and I demand she be removed from this property before she ruins my daughter's engagement," he roared, his face flushed a deep, violent crimson as his trembling finger pointed straight at my dress blues. If this story makes your heart pound and proves that true honor always exposes the darkest snakes in your own family, hit that subscribe button right now to support real military endurance. I didn't flinch, even as 58 pairs of eyes locked onto the silver ribbons pinning my chest, because what Uncle Jonathan didn't know, what none of them in that suffocating ballroom knew, was that the blood dried on the inner collar wasn't from a battlefield in Helmand, but from the locked library upstairs, where I had found my late father's missing service records 5 minutes before dinner was served. "Jonathan, sit down," my mother hissed, grabbing his sleeve, her voice laced with a terrifying desperation that made my stomach twist, though she never once looked me in the eye. "She's just trying to cause a scene, like she always does when the family tries to move on." Move on from what? The lie they had sold to the Department of Veterans Affairs 3 years ago? Or the fact that my father hadn't died of a heart attack in his sleep, but had died clutching a signed power of attorney form that bore my mother's forged signature? I stepped forward, the heels of my parade shoes clicking heavily against the dark marble floor, and pulled a tarnished brass pocket watch from my dress coat pocket, the same watch Jonathan claimed my father had traded away to pay off his gambling debts in Fort Liberty. "You told the whole family my father died in shame, Uncle Jonathan," I said, my voice cutting through the silent room like a razor. "So why is his official seal pressed into the back of this watch, which was hidden inside the lining of your private wall safe?" Jonathan's eyes widened, a microscopic tremor hitting his lower jaw, but before he could utter a single word of defense, my cousin Victoria, the glowing bride-to-be, leaned across the table and snatched the watch right out of my hand, pitching it directly into a bucket of melting ice. "You're a psychotoxic liar, Helena," Victoria screamed, her voice cracking with calculated hysteria. "You killed your own squad in Syria, you got dishonorably discharged, and now you're trying to ruin my life because Brandon chose me instead of you." The room gasped in collective horror, heads turning toward Brandon, my ex-fiancé, who sat beside Victoria with his head bowed, meticulously picking at the gold band on his finger without offering a single word to contradict her terrifying lie. I stood completely frozen, not because of Victoria's brutal public accusation, but because beneath the clear ice water in the silver bucket, the watch casing wasn't foggy. The dark red resin seals inside it were slowly dissolving, releasing a tiny waterproof microdrive that my father had sealed inside with industrial epoxy before his death. "She's mentally unstable, ladies and gentlemen," Jonathan announced, stepping toward me with his hand outstretched, his voice dropping into a smooth, theatrical tone of fake pity. "The military broke her, and we've been trying to get her psychiatric help for months, but tonight she's crossed a line. Hand over your phone and leave." He reached aggressively for my coat pocket, but I caught his wrist in a military-grade joint lock, twisting just enough to pin his arm behind his back, while leaning close to his ear. "If you touch me again, I'll tell the room why Brandon's father paid your company $2 million the exact week my father's military life insurance policy vanished," I whispered, feeling the violent shudder that instantly rippled through his entire body. Jonathan didn't scream. He slowly relaxed his arm, leaned into my ear, and whispered back with a cold, sickening smile that chilled me to the bone. "Do it, Helena. Tell them, and watch your mother go to federal prison tomorrow for signing the offshore wire transfer." My grip loosened in absolute shock, my mind reeling as I stared at my mother, who quietly took a deep sip of her wine and nodded toward the estate security guard standing by the tall mahogany doors. "Escort her out," my mother commanded smoothly, her tone devoid of any maternal warmth. "And make sure she leaves her coat. It belongs to her father's estate, which belongs to us." The two heavy-set guards stepped forward, their leather boots squeaking on the marble. But before their fingers could graze my shoulders, the massive double doors of the ballroom burst open with a booming crash that shattered the room's tense atmosphere. A tall, imposing figure in a crisp, spotless dress uniform stepped through the archway, his 3 silver stars catching the overhead chandelier light, flanked by 2 heavily armed military police officers holding sealed black tactical binders. It was Commanding General Thomas Sterling, the head of U.S. Army Cyber Command, and his icy gray eyes didn't look at the floral arrangements, the 58 frozen guests, or Uncle Jonathan. They locked directly onto me. "Captain Helena Vance." General Sterling's voice echoed across the vaulted ceiling like thunder. "You are 80 minutes late for your debriefing regarding Operation Silver Shield, and your encrypted radio transmitter is currently broadcasting from this room." A collective drop in air pressure hit the room as Uncle Jonathan's face went from pale red to ghostly white, his hand instinctively flying to his left inner jacket pocket, where a faint, rhythmic electronic beep suddenly began to pulse. "General," Jonathan stuttered, stepping forward with his hands raised in an attempt to project authority. "There's been a massive misunderstanding. My niece is under active psychological evaluation, and she breached this private property." "Shut your mouth, civilian," General Sterling snapped, without even looking at him, walking straight up to me and saluting with absolute precision, which I returned with a steady, unyielding arm. "Captain Vance, is this the individual who attempted to intercept your drive recovery 5 minutes ago?" "Yes, sir," I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. "And the secondary receiver is currently inside my cousin's ice bucket." Victoria let out a sharp, terrified shriek as one of the military police officers stepped around the table, reached into the melting ice, and pulled out the tiny black microdrive that had floated free from the watch casing. "That's illegal! You can't search my personal property!" Victoria screamed, her eyes darting frantically toward Brandon, who suddenly stood up so fast his heavy dining chair overturned behind him. "Victoria, stop talking," Brandon yelled, his face dripping with cold sweat, as he backed away from the head table toward the open French doors leading to the dark garden terrace outside. "Sit down, son," General Sterling said coldly, nodding to the second MP officer, who immediately stepped into Brandon's path and cut off his escape route with an unyielding chest. "Nobody leaves this room until the JAG Corps finishes verifying the military assets transferred into the Sterling Manor's shell accounts." My mother dropped her wineglass. It shattered on the floor, spraying red liquid across the hem of her expensive silk gown like fresh arterial spray. "Helena, what did you do?" she whimpered, her manipulative composure finally fracturing into raw terror. "We did this for the family. We did this to protect you." "You didn't do it to protect me, Mom," I said, stepping closer to her and pulling a small yellowed piece of paper from inside my dress shoe, where I had stashed it an hour ago. "You did it because Uncle Jonathan convinced my father was going to leave everything to his former squad members' families after the ambush in Kandahar." The entire room fell in a terrifying, heavy silence as I unfolded the paper, a field receipt stamped by the 75th Ranger Regiment, signed not by my father, but by Brandon's father 20 years ago. "This isn't a land deed," I said, looking straight at Brandon, who dropped to his knees right there on the parquet floor, burying his face in his trembling hands. "This isn't a non-disclosure agreement for a high-grade military shipment that went missing in 2005, the same shipment Uncle Jonathan used to launch his private defense firm. You think this piece of paper proves anything, you ungrateful little bitch?" Uncle Jonathan roared, losing his mind completely as he reached into his jacket, pulling out a small silver voice recorder and holding it high above his head for all 58 guests to see. "I have your signed confession right here. You signed the discharge papers. You took the fall for the tactical breach." General Sterling let out a low, dark laugh that sent chills down the spine of every person standing in that grand room. "He thinks the discharge was real," the general said softly to his chief officer, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "What, what do you mean?" Jonathan stammered, his arms slowly dropping as his eyes darted between the general and me in total blinding confusion. "Captain Vance was never discharged, Mr. Sterling," General Sterling stated, his voice ringing with absolute terrifying authority. "For the last 3 years, she has been operating under deep-cover Joint Special Operations Command, specifically assigned to track the illegal liquidation of military pensions by private defense contractors, starting with yours." My mother gasped, clutching her throat as she collapsed backward into her chair, her eyes wide with the horrifying realization that every single time she had tried to manipulate me over the past 36 months, every time she thought she was breaking my spirit, she was actually feeding evidence directly into an active federal investigation. You lied to us?" Victoria sobbed, her expensive bridal makeup running down her face in dark streaks. "You let us treat you like garbage? You let everyone in this city think you were a disgrace?" "I didn't lie to you, Victoria," I said coldly, looking her dead in the eyes with a calm that made her flinch. "I just allowed you to show everyone in this room exactly who you really are when you think nobody with real authority is watching." "This is a setup," Jonathan shouted, his voice cracking as he backed up against the head table, knocking over silver platters and fine china. "Brandon, tell them her father was the one who signed off on the account transfer. Tell them he took the money." Brandon didn't look up. He was weeping openly now, his shoulders shaking uncontrollably. "I can't lie anymore, Uncle Jonathan," Brandon whispered, his voice picking up through the silent hall. "They showed me the audit logs yesterday. You used my dad's authorization code, but it was your biometric signature that confirmed the wire transfer from the base in Norfolk." The room erupted into a chaos of whispered shock, guests leaning across tables, pulling out their phones and staring at Uncle Jonathan like he was a venomous snake trapped in a glass jar. "You backstabbing little coward!" Jonathan lunged toward Brandon, but the MP officer seized him by his collar, driving him face first onto the linen-covered table, knocking over a 3-tiered crystal centerpiece that crashed onto the floor in thousands of glittering shards. "Jonathan Sterling," the MP officer announced, pulling heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt and ratcheting them tightly around Jonathan's wrists. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, treason, and the unlawful conversion of government assets." As the steel cuffs clicked shut, the heavy, oppressing weight that had been sitting on my chest for 3 long years suddenly evaporated, replaced with a cold, crystalline clarity that made every detail in the room hyper-distinct. "Wait!" my mother screamed, rushing toward General Sterling with her hands clasped together in desperate plea. "General, please, I'm her mother. I didn't know what Jonathan was doing. He forced me to sign those documents. He threatened to foreclose on the property." General Sterling didn't even look at her. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a second audio playback device, hitting the small black button on the side. My mother's own voice filled the high-ceilinged room, crystal clear, recorded just 48 hours ago in her private sitting room. "If we push Helena hard enough at the rehearsal dinner, she'll lose her temper and strike Jonathan. Once she strikes him, her military pension is void, and the trust fund automatically rolls over to Victoria's wedding fund. Just make sure Brandon keeps her distracted." My mother froze instantly, her mouth remaining open in an unfinished word, her face draining of every single drop of color as 58 guests gasped in utter disgust. Victoria backed away from her mother, staring at her with pure horror. You You were going to use my wedding to steal her pension? Victoria whispered, realizing in an instant that her entire dream life was built on a foundation of rotting criminal deceit. I did it for you, Victoria, my mother shrieked, tears streaming down her face as she reached for her daughter's hand, but Victoria yanked her hand away, stepping completely out of her mother's reach. Don't touch me, Victoria spat out, her voice dripping with venomous realization. You didn't do it for me. You did it so you wouldn't lose this manor. I stood in the center of the room, watching the complete, total collapse of the family that had spent years trying to make me feel like a broken, unhinged outcast. They didn't break me. They had simply sharpened me into the exact instrument that was going to dismantle their comfortable, parasitic lives. Captain Vance, General Sterling said quietly, stepping beside me as the MPs began dragging Jonathan out through the grand mahogany doors, his shouting echoing down the long carpeted hallways. Captain Vance, the federal marshals are currently executing a search warrant on the estate's private vault upstairs. They found your father's original Distinguished Service Cross. A lump formed in my throat, the first true hit of emotion breaking through my tactical composure, but I kept my chin held high, refusing to let a single tear drop in front of the people who had slandered his memory.
"Where was it, sir?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Inside your uncle's personal wall safe," General Sterling replied softly, pulling a velvet-lined wooden box from his binder and handing it to me. "He hid it because your father had written a final letter inside the lining, addressed directly to you." I opened the box with trembling fingers. Inside lay the gleaming metal resting on a faded piece of military stationery, written in my father's strong, angular handwriting. I didn't read it out loud, but as my eyes scanned the first sentence, "Helena, if you are reading this, it means they think they've buried the truth, but they forgot you are my daughter, and you know how to fight in the dark." I looked up and met my mother's terrified, pleading eyes one last time. "Is there anything else you want to say to them, Captain?" General Sterling asked, his hand resting respectfully near his side. I looked at my mother, then at Victoria, who was now weeping silently on the floor beside her ruined wedding setup, and finally at Brandon, who couldn't even bring himself to look at the floor where I stood. "No, General," I said, closing the velvet box with a firm, decisive snap that echoed through the silent, ruined ballroom. I turned my back on the 58 guests, on the broken glass, on the ruined wedding dress, and on the mother who had sold my father's honor for a handful of silver, and I walked out of the Sterling Manor into the cool, clean night air of Charleston. As I stepped into the back of the black military SUV parked at the base of the grand staircase, I knew that true justice doesn't come from anger or revenge. It comes when you stand completely still in your own truth and let the liar's own trap snap shut around their neck.